A Rose by Any Other Name. Janie sat on the edge of the sofa reading the last page with an expression of mingled awe, fascination, and grief etched across her face. When she finished reading, she added the page to the others that sat on the table and tapped them into a neat stack before replacing them in the large envelope. For a moment, she was at a loss of words. She stood from the couch, crossed the room to the bar in the corner, and poured herself a drink. Drinking it down, she poured another, then drained that glass too before pouring another. She stood with her head bowed, shoulders hunched, one hand grasping the glass and the other curled into a fist against the mahogany of the bar. When she lifted her head, her emerald eyes stared back at her from the reflection in the bar mirror, and she shook her head. At what exactly? She didn't know. It just felt like the right thing to do. She drained the glass once again, frowning as the liquor burned a path down her throat and into her stomach. Taking a deep breath, she tilted her head back to stare at the mural painted on the ceiling. A galaxy of stars winked down at her. Jenny loved the stars. They always had a calming effect on her. No matter what mood she was in, the various constellations and the promise of something more always made her feel better. She took another deep breath before hurling the glass she held into the bar mirror that shattered on impact. 7 years of bad luck. Who gave a fuck? 7 years added onto a lifetime filled with nothing but black cat days didn't mean shit. Grabbing a second glass from the bar, she filled it with tequila and turned to glare at the letter that still sat on the table. She didn't need to read it again. She knew what it said. The words were emblazoned on her mind's eye for the rest of her life. Dear Janie, if you're reading this note, I suppose you found my secret. I trust you to do what needs to be done. Burn it. Ha ha. You know that I would have done the same for you. Ed. 35 little words. Each one screamed out to her, but all she understood was how wrong he was. She had no idea what needed to be done and did not know what he would have done in her situation. One thing she did know with a deep certainty that threatened to choke her was this. Ed was a fucking bastard. She'd always known that, but the stupid letter and the damnable package that lay on her coffee table proved what she hadn't needed proving. He'd do anything to piss on her cornflakes, and the events of the past morning were all just one big whiz. Her eyes drifted from the letter to the thick manila folder. She was certain that damn thing was mocking her, just like that son of a bitch had done. Mocked her with every keystroke. Janie shook her head, clearing away the thoughts that like squiggly lines on an etch-a-sketch board. Picking up her drink, she walked over to the window, heaving a sigh that ruffled the fine fabric of the curtains and belied the size of the person who stood before them. Holding her sweater close as if to fight off a chill that the bright morning sun secreted, she sipped from her glass and imagined Ed seated at the nearby mahogany desk. He probably had a cigar burning in an ashtray and a half-empty glass of scotch on a coaster to complete the pretentious picture of a man in his study, or rather her study. This was her favorite room in the house. The Persian rugs were hand-woven and hand-selected to match the heavy furnishings. Bookcases lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and a ladder slid around the shelves on coasters. She loved climbing that ladder to reach a book on one of the higher shelves. The books were not in alphabetical order. In fact, there wasn't a system of any kind to the shelf placements. Janie liked that it could take her hours or days to locate a book. It made her feel like a real intellectual. She was immensely proud that a book had to be read to earn place on her bookcases. There were thousands of books in this room, and she'd read each and every one of them. It was she who had selected each piece of furniture, from the overstuffed chairs that nearly swallowed her tiny frame to the heavy solid wood end tables. A round table sat beneath a framed 17th century world map. She loved the original map, which she'd first seen in an antique store on a trip to London. She couldn't afford it, of course, but was more than willing to pay the few $100s for a replica. The 18th century desk was an original. She sat at an estate auction for 9 hours one cold, wet November day to claim her prize. She was the one who emptied out every penny in her savings account to possess that beautiful piece of wood. She knew that just by sitting at it, she'd be able to create something wonderful, something breathtaking to read, something magical. Yet it was Ed who had. She took another small sip from her glass and shook the Etch-a-Sketch board again. What did any of that matter now? Ed was gone. After 8 years of a tumultuous marriage, he couldn't stand her and she despised him. By the end of it, they'd barely been able to be in the same room together without the pettiness. But this letter proved that it hadn't always been that way between them, didn't it? I mean, he joked, burn it. He'd even added a ha-ha. On the other hand, maybe the letter was the irrefutable proof that there was always animosity, jealous, and pettiness between them. He added the fucking ha-ha, didn't he? The letter lacked a date, but the date stamped across the top of the packet preceded their divorce by 2 years. She could only assume that the letter and the packet were from the same time frame. When you assume, you only make an ass out of you and me, her father had said often enough. Once again, Janie had to admit that her father had been right. He'd warned her not to marry Ed, even volunteered to drive her to a convent as he walked her down the aisle. She smiled, chuckling softly as she recalled the look on the preacher's face as he watched their procession. Her father had taken the smallest steps his 6'3" frame could muster and refused to be hurried. By the time they reached the altar, she had been all but pulling him along. Maybe she should call Guinness and inquire if there had ever been a longer walk to the altar. Sean Middleton had been right, though. Marrying Ed was a colossal mistake. She should have known that right there at the wedding. Her father had taken the smallest, slowest steps possible, making the length of the aisle appear as a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The 20 or 30 feet had become light years. While everyone else at the wedding stared and gawked, wondering why the walk down the aisle had taken a millennia to complete, Ed had just stood there in his tux, smiling, waiting. He hadn't even lifted an eyebrow. Couldn't have been normal. That should have set off alarm bells. She should have let her father take her to that convent, or across the border, or accepted any of the other outrageous suggestions he'd offered. Janie looked out the window at the manicured lawn and garden, remembering when she planted the pink rose bushes. She could almost remember the elation she felt when they bloomed that first spring. The garden was so full, so colorful, so bursting with life those first few years. Then little by little, the flowers just stopped blooming. First the morning glories, then the azaleas, then finally the marigold. Her garden died piece by piece, just like her marriage had. She knew about the garden, the time it took to bloom, then the seasons when it systematically stopped. What she didn't know about was Ed. When had Ed had time to do it? I mean, true, they avoided one another like two unvaccinated people in a room filled with smallpox victims, but still, shouldn't she have known what was going on in her own home? She knew about the damned roses, for God's sake. Janie turned from the window to give a considering look to the packet. Her eyes heaped questions upon it, but it sat in silence, refusing to offer any answers. The only person who could give those answers was Ed. Non-imaginative, dry as day-old toast left out on the counter. Ed, the fucking engineer. And yet, she set her glass down on the coffee table as she passed it on her way to the tiny alcove. She sat down in one of the overstuffed leather chairs and picked up the receiver on the Prince's telephone. Her finger traced the number she still knew by heart, and she mumbled, "Son of a bitch," with each rotation of the rotary dial. Leave it to Ed to find a way to make her contact him. Leave it to Ed to not answer the fucking phone, she shouted when his voicemail picked up. Replacing the receiver with all the gentle force of a rhinoceros in the wild, she sprang up from the chair and ran agitated hands through her short cropped hair. What was she supposed to do? The anger dissipated suddenly and she sank back down onto the recently vacated chair. She should have been filled with options. Ideas were her wellspring of life, or at least she wanted them to be. Had wanted them to be her sustenance since she was 13 years old. She'd even created this room for them so they'd have a place to reach her, and she them. But they had always eluded her. Ideas just stood inside the peripheral vision and refused to come any closer. They mocked her just as Ed Package was doing. She should pile the fireplace with as many logs as she could stuff into it, surround those with last week's newspapers, then toss on the hated packet and 12 matches. Her head dropped into her hands and she sat in a contemplation for a moment before bracing herself to stand again. Her hands were on her knees when the phone on the table beside her rang and she jumped. Fucking Ed. Asshole always did have lousy timing. What? She growled into the phone, but was taken aback by the feminine voice in her ear. Janie? Who the hell else will be answering Janie's phone, genius? There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line and she almost regretted being so harsh. But the pause wasn't that pregnant and she wasn't in the mood for stupidity. Besides, the caller spoke again before regret could find a firm foothold. You just called Ed? I saw your name on the caller ID. Did all of the girl's comments have to sound like questions? Multiple stinging remarks came to mind, but she forced them back in lieu of an attempt at civility. Yes, I did. Well, I'm not sure that you know. The girl broke off and Jane rolled her eyes. Here it comes. Some kid fresh from the schoolroom was going to tell her that she was Ed's new wife, or steady girlfriend, or his special friend, or whatever the hell he called women young enough to be his daughter these days, and that she didn't appreciate seeing his ex-wife's name on the caller ID. Janie waited, but there was no such forthcoming proclamation. She sighed. Good Lord, today wasn't the day for such nonsense. She reached for her glass, but realized it sat on the coffee table where she left it. She slumped back, shaking her head at the absurdity of the situation. The packet, the call, her drink being out of reach, all of it. What do you want? I was kind of busy. Plotting the man's slow and painful demise required uninterrupted concentration. And to think, she'd only been innocently searching her desk for a pen when she discovered the bomb hidden deep in the bottom drawer. Well, it's just that... Again, a brief pause. You know Ed? Vaguely, but go on. What? I don't understand. Janie waved a hand in dismissal. Nothing. It was humor that obviously went over your head. Proceed. Okay. But, you know Ed? Realizing her mistake and picking up the dangling thread of the conversation in the same spot in which she left off, the girl rushed on. Well, I saw your name on the ID and thought I should call and tell you. She stopped speaking and Janie's irritation filled the silence. For God's sake, please stop with the damn inflections. It's nerve-wracking as hell. Whatever you've called to say, spit it out so we can end this infernal call. I've already lost 5 minutes of my life that I will never get back. Well, ma'am, hearing the inflection, the girl cleared her throat and tried again. To make up for the forced horizontal tone, she spoke slower, as if concentrating on the words. Well, Ed, he's what? Your man, your honey, your boo, he's dead, ma'am. Ed is dead. During her malicious questioning, Janie closed her eyes, but at the girl's words, they sprang open. Excuse me? She sat up slowly as though her posture were the cause for her mishearing the statement. Dead. Ed's dead. He died 2 days ago. I just thought that you might want to know. This time she was not rushed, so she was able to complete her sentences in a carefully even tone. But how did... Unable to form a coherent question, Janie stopped speaking. Again, she reached for the non-existent glass beside her, but it still sat on the table across the room. Fucking inconsiderate. She mumbled, not certain if she was referring to Ed or the glass. I just thought you should know. You don't have to be so rude. He told me about you, and Jenny rolled her eyes. Give me a break, Barbie. I wasn't talking about you. Well, fine. You do whatever, but the funeral is Saturday. Come if you want, or don't. I don't care. And my name is Missy, bitch, not Barbie. The line went dead, and Janie laughed without humor. Missy. She pictured blonde curls, big blue eyes, and a chest that ventured past the third letter in the alphabet and came in doubles. Of course it is, she mimicked aloud. Who the hell names a child Missy and expects anything less than an airhead? Just like every Candy was born to be a stripper and Destiny was doomed for failure. Janie leaned over and replaced the receiver, letting her hand rest on the phone for a while. Ed was dead. Sounded like a Dr. Seuss story. Ed was dead. How dead was Ed? Dead Ed. Dead Ed? She added the inflection, then placed her head on the arm of the chair and cried. Stupid son of a bitch. A few minutes passed and her head came up. Janie wiped the remaining tears from her dark lashes. She was proud of herself. She'd heard Ed was dead. She stifled a nervous whisper, a nervous laugh at the rhyme. And maybe to eke out a few genuine tears of sorrow, she'd managed to do it. Probably more than his miserable ass would have shed if the shoe were on the other foot. She glanced at the packet on the table and was struck by the appropriateness of her finding it today of all days. Then she started to laugh. Her laughter mingled with fresh tears, and she cried until she started to hiccup. The hiccups gave way to panic, and her gaze searched for a brown paper bag. But why would she have a brown paper bag in her study? Well, duh. In case she started to hyperventilate like now. She slid her blue jean-clad knees apart, leaned over, and placed her head between them while taking deep breaths. She was a college professor, but all she'd ever wanted to be was an author. A world-renowned, award-winning author, but the words had never come. She'd never written a thing. Ed was dead, and she'd found his secret. The worst injustice he'd ever done to her was suddenly a gift. It could not be this easy. Life was never this easy for her, ever. I mean, seriously. Life didn't like her enough to be easy. But here it was, all of a sudden, easy as pie. Easy as taking candy from a baby or from a dead person. She amended the cliche and released a morbid giggle. She clasped a hand to her mouth to stifle the sound she was certain would become hysteria. But she couldn't stop thinking of the humor of the situation. It was funny. Insanely funny. He trusted her to do what needed to be done. He would have done the same thing for her. Janie sat up and shook the bangs that had fallen across her face away. She'd do what needed to be done all right, and she was damn sure he'd have done the same thing. Gutless coward. The packet on the table proved his cowardice. Janie Middleton Stewart may be a lot of things, but damned if she was a coward. Yes, she knew exactly what needed to be done, and she was going to do it. Then she was going to go buy the most decadent black dress she could find and wear it to that bastard's funeral. Attending the funeral was the very least she could do for him, considering. Rising from the chair, she crossed over to the table, picked up her glass, and drained the last of her drink. Carrying the packet, she walked over to the desk. She'd attend the funeral, say her goodbyes, but first things first. With sure and certain fingers, she slipped the pages from the manila folder and turned on her computer. She brought up a blank document, typed the title, and after a brief pause of hesitation, she typed, by Janie Middleton Stewart. 2 years later, she sat behind a large desk in an intimate bookstore, smiling at the line of people who had come to see her. Could you sign it to Grace, please? The blonde woman offered a shy smile, hugging the book to her chest before placing it on the desk. Can I ask you, where did you get this story from? It's one of the best debut novels I've ever read. The story is so beautifully written. Janie smiled, accepting the compliment. Thank you. And I don't really know. It just came to me at a very appropriate time in my life. I've been trying to write for years, but nothing worthwhile ever developed. Then one day, she shrugged, handing the woman her autographed book. It just came to me. Janie looked the other woman straight in the eye. Some days it doesn't even feel like I wrote it. The story literally fell in my lap. The woman hugged the book to her bosom, sharing Janie's smile. The best ones always do, don't they?